There is a compliment that sounds harmless. You're such a good person. At first, it feels warm, affirming, safe. But over time, something subtle happens. You stop experiencing it as praise and start experiencing it as expectation. Being good is no longer something you choose. It becomes something you must maintain. And that is where the paradox begins. Because the moment goodness becomes an identity, it also becomes a pressure. You begin to monitor yourself, not consciously, but quietly. You hesitate before expressing irritation. You soften your opinions. You prioritize harmony over honesty. Not because you are weak, but because you learn that being good preserves connection, and connection feels like safety. The question is not whether kindness is valuable. It is. The question is, what are you protecting by always being kind? Many people who are too good did not choose that role deliberately. They adapted into it. Perhaps conflict in your environment felt overwhelming. Perhaps love felt conditional. Perhaps approval came when you were agreeable. So you became steady, reliable, mature, and it worked. You were appreciated. But slowly, the role fused with your sense of self, and now, stepping outside of it feels dangerous. If you express anger, will they see you differently? If you say no, will you lose your place? If you disappoint someone, will you still belong? This is the hidden tension behind excessive goodness. It is not purity, it is fear of disconnection. Because when your identity is built around being good, you are no longer relating freely. You are performing stability, you are managing perception, you are preserving an image, and images are fragile. The dark side of being too good is not that you are secretly bad, it is that you may have never allowed yourself to be fully human. Human means capable of contradiction, capable of irritation, capable of selfishness, capable of boundaries. But when goodness becomes your defining trait, complexity feels threatening. So you simplify yourself. You become predictable, and predictability wins approval. But it can also cost authenticity. This is where our exploration begins, not to destroy kindness, but to examine what happens when kindness is driven by fear. Because there is a difference between being good and needing to be seen as good. And that difference changes everything. At some point, being good stopped being something you did. It became who you are. You became the calm one, the understanding one, the responsible one. Not because someone forced you, but because it worked. When you were patient, tension decreased. When you were agreeable, you were praised. When you absorbed discomfort, others felt relieved. And slowly, your personality organized itself around that reinforcement. This is how identity forms, not through dramatic decisions, but through repeated adaptation. You learn which traits secure connection. You amplify them. You hide the rest. The agreeable parts stay visible. The inconvenient parts go underground. You may not even remember when it happened, but now, expressing irritation feels unnatural. Setting boundaries feels harsh. Saying no feels like betrayal. Because your self-image is tied to harmony. And when identity depends on harmony, conflict feels existential. It is no longer just disagreement. It feels like a threat to belonging. So you anticipate tension before it arises. You adjust your tone. You filter your reactions. You manage emotional atmospheres. You become highly attuned to others and gradually disconnected from yourself. This is the hidden cost. When goodness becomes identity, self-worth becomes conditional. You feel stable when others are pleased, unsettled when someone is dissatisfied, even if their dissatisfaction has nothing to do with you. You internalize responsibility for emotional equilibrium. But equilibrium maintained through self-suppression is not balance. It is control. And control requires constant vigilance. The deeper issue is not that you are kind. It is that you may not know who you are outside that role. If you were not the good one, who would you be? Would you still feel valuable? Still feel safe? Still feel needed? These questions are uncomfortable because they expose something fragile. If your identity depends on being perceived as good, then any deviation feels destabilizing. So you avoid deviation. You remain consistent, predictable, acceptable. But human beings are not meant to be one-dimensional. You contain irritation and compassion, self-interest and generosity, firmness and warmth. When only one side is allowed, the other does not disappear. It waits, and what waits in the background eventually demands attention. The transformation begins the moment you recognize this. You are not your role. You are not the emotional stabilizer of every room. You are not responsible for preventing all disappointment. You are a person, and a person is more complex than a single virtue. There is a specific discomfort that follows you. It appears when someone's tone changes, when a message feels shorter than usual, when you sense even mild disapproval. It is not the fear of being wrong. It is the fear of disappointing. For someone who built their identity around being good, disappointment feels dangerous. Not logically, emotionally. Because somewhere inside, disappointment is linked to rejection. If they are upset, you assume you failed. If you failed, you assume connection is at risk. So you move quickly to repair. You explain yourself, you soften your stance, you take responsibility, even when it is not yours. Not because you are manipulative, but because tension feels unsafe. This pattern often forms early. Perhaps harmony in your environment depended on you not adding more conflict. Perhaps approval was given when you were easy to deal with. Perhaps love felt warm, but fragile. So your nervous system adapted. Your needs became negotiable. Other people's emotions became urgent. And now, even as an adult, you instinctively prioritize preserving comfort over expressing truth. You say yes before reflecting. You apologize before assessing. You adjust before being asked. Because preventing disappointment feels easier than tolerating it. But here is the deeper reality. Disappointment is not abandonment. It is difference. And difference is unavoidable in real relationships. When you avoid disappointing others at all costs, you also avoid being fully known. Because being known includes being disagreed with. It includes having boundaries. It includes, sometimes, choosing yourself. The fear of disappointing hides another fear. If I stop being easy, will I still be loved? This is where goodness becomes attachment strategy. You become indispensable, always helpful, always supportive, always available. And being needed feels like security. But being needed is not the same as being loved. If your value depends on constant availability, rest feels selfish. Saying no feels threatening. Choosing yourself feels wrong. And so you continue adapting. But every time you silence your truth to prevent discomfort, you reinforce the belief that your authenticity is dangerous. The transformation begins when you question that belief. What if someone being disappointed does not mean you are bad? What if tension does not equal loss? What if love that collapses under a boundary was never stable to begin with? The fear of disappointing others keeps you small, but staying small does not protect connection. It only protects illusion, and illusion always demands sacrifice. If you are always kind, where does your anger go? If you are always understanding, where does your judgment go? If you are always selfless, what happens to your desire? It does not disappear, it goes underground. Every identity is built not only from what is expressed, but from what is rejected. When you decided, consciously or not, that being good was essential for connection, you also decided that certain traits were dangerous. Irritation, self-interest, impatience, assertiveness. So you pushed them aside, not because they were immoral, but because they threatened your image. This is how the shadow forms, not as evil, but as the collection of traits you were never allowed to show. The problem is not that you have these impulses. The problem is that you refuse to recognize them. And what is unrecognized does not become weaker. It becomes indirect. It shows up as subtle sarcasm, as emotional withdrawal, as exhaustion you cannot explain, as quiet resentment toward people you care about, and then guilt, because that reaction contradicts your identity, so you suppress it again. But suppression does not dissolve energy, it stores it. The more rigid your goodness becomes, the more pressure builds beneath it. You may even find yourself irritated by people who are direct, uncomfortable with those who say no easily, judging those who prioritize themselves. Yet beneath that judgment might be something more honest: envy. They are expressing what you have disallowed in yourself. The shadow often contains not only what you reject, but what you secretly long to embody: strength, clarity, boundaries. When these qualities are integrated, they do not destroy kindness, they strengthen it. But when they are denied, your kindness becomes fragile, rigid, defensive. True maturity is not eliminating your darker impulses, it is understanding them. Your anger can become clarity, your selfishness can become self-respect, your firmness can become stability, but only if you admit they exist. The danger is not that you have a shadow. The danger is believing that you shouldn't. Because the moment you accept that you are capable of both light and darkness, your identity stops being a performance. It becomes human. And being human is not a moral failure. It is wholeness. Self-betrayal rarely feels dramatic. It does not announce itself as a crisis. It feels like a small hesitation before answering, a quiet yes that should have been a no, a subtle tightening in your chest that you ignore. And because nothing explodes, you assume nothing is wrong. But something is. Every time you override your internal truth to preserve your image, a fracture forms. Not visible, not immediate, but cumulative. You agree when you are exhausted. You show up when you need rest. You listen when you want space. And you tell yourself it is generosity. Sometimes it is. But sometimes it is fear. Fear of being seen as difficult. Fear of being perceived as selfish. Fear of losing your role. The deeper problem is not that you give too much. It is that you no longer check whether giving is aligned. When goodness becomes automatic, choice disappears. And without choice, there is no authenticity. You are not responding freely. You are reacting predictably. This is where virtue slowly turns into self-neglect. You begin to feel invisible, not because others ignore you, but because you have stopped expressing yourself clearly. You trained people to expect availability. You presented yourself as endlessly capable. Now you feel trapped by the expectation you helped create. And that realization is uncomfortable, because it means you are not only a victim of circumstances, you are participating in the pattern. There is a painful honesty required here. Sometimes you say yes because it maintains control. If you are always helpful, you remain necessary. If you remain necessary, you feel secure. But security built on usefulness is fragile. It demands constant performance. You cannot rest. You cannot withdraw. You cannot change without destabilizing the system. So you continue, until exhaustion begins to surface, until subtle irritation grows, until you feel disconnected from your own desires. And then comes the quiet question: when was the last time I chose something for myself without guilt? If that question feels heavy, it reveals the cost. Self-betrayal disconnects you from vitality. It dulls your spontaneity. It turns kindness into obligation. And obligation, sustained long enough, breeds resentment. The transformation begins not with rebellion, but with awareness. Awareness that your limits are not weaknesses, that saying no is not cruelty, that choosing yourself is not abandonment. The real shift happens when you allow goodness to become voluntary again. When you give because you want to. When you stop before depletion. When you let your internal signals matter. Because the moment you stop betraying yourself, your kindness stops being survival and starts being truth. Resentment does not begin as anger. It begins as imbalance. You continue giving. You continue adjusting. You continue being reliable. But something inside starts to keep score, not consciously, quietly. You notice when your effort is not reciprocated, when your availability is assumed, when your sacrifices go unnamed, and a subtle thought appears: they don't see how much I do. Resentment is often misunderstood as hostility, but more often it is emotional debt. You have been giving beyond your capacity and expecting, without saying it, that others will recognize the cost. When they don't, something tightens. The good person struggles with resentment because it contradicts the image. You are supposed to give freely, without expectation, without calculation. So when bitterness arises, you feel ashamed. But resentment is not proof that you are selfish. It is proof that you have been overextending. There is a psychological contract hidden beneath excessive goodness. I will take care of you, and in return, I will feel valued. When that value feels uncertain, the system destabilizes. You feel unappreciated, overlooked, taken for granted. But here is the uncomfortable truth. Often, people treat you according to the boundaries you demonstrate. If you rarely say no, they assume you are fine. If you rarely express fatigue, they assume you have capacity. If you rarely communicate needs, they assume you have none. This does not make them malicious. It reveals the pattern. Resentment grows where boundaries are unclear. It is the signal that your external behavior and internal reality are misaligned. You said yes while meaning maybe. You agreed while feeling tired. You helped while feeling invisible. And now your body protests. Small requests trigger disproportionate irritation, not because the request is unreasonable, but because it connects to accumulated self-denial. Resentment is stored honesty. It is the truth you did not express at the moment it mattered. The danger is not resentment itself. The danger is suppressing it. When suppressed, it turns into coldness, passive aggression, emotional distance, and relationships slowly erode. But when acknowledged, resentment becomes guidance. It asks a simple question: where have you abandoned yourself? If you can answer that without shame, the pattern begins to change. Because resentment is not a moral flaw. It is a boundary asking to be recognized. There is something stabilizing about being liked. When people see you as kind, reliable, and agreeable, relationships feel smooth, predictable, safe. But beneath that smoothness, something subtle is happening. You are managing perception. You adjust your tone to avoid tension. You soften your truth to prevent friction. You anticipate reactions before they occur. Not consciously, instinctively, because if you can control how others experience you, you reduce uncertainty, and uncertainty feels threatening. This is where approval becomes a form of psychological control. If everyone sees you as good, you feel protected from rejection. If no one is upset with you, you feel secure. But that security depends on consistency. It depends on you not changing too much, not becoming too direct, not becoming too firm, not becoming inconvenient. So you remain careful. You filter your reactions. You delay your boundaries. You dilute your intensity. Harmony is preserved, but authenticity is negotiated. The illusion is that approval guarantees safety, but approval is conditional. It lasts as long as you align with expectations, and expectations are unstable. You cannot control how someone interprets you. You cannot control whether someone feels disappointed. You cannot control whether someone stays. Yet, the too good pattern tries anyway. It tries to eliminate relational risk by eliminating friction. But friction is not the enemy of connection. Avoidance is. When you remove all tension from relationships, you also remove depth. Because depth requires honesty, and honesty sometimes disrupts comfort. The deeper question becomes, are you being kind, or are you trying to prevent rejection? If your goodness is motivated by fear of loss, it is not freedom. It is strategy. And strategy requires constant effort. True safety does not come from being universally liked. It comes from internal alignment, from knowing that your yes is real, your no is clear, your presence is not a performance. When you stop trying to control how you are perceived, something shifts. Some people may distance themselves, others may feel you more genuinely. Because authenticity is not always smooth, but it is solid. The cost of approval-based identity is the slow erosion of self-trust. The reward of authenticity is stability that does not depend on applause. And that stability cannot be taken away by someone else's disappointment. The goal was never to stop being good. It was to stop being divided. For a long time, you believed your value depended on consistency, on being patient, on being reliable, on being easy to love. But real maturity does not demand perfection. It demands integration. Integration means accepting that you are capable of kindness and irritation, generosity and limits, warmth and firmness. It means recognizing that your anger is not a threat to your goodness. Your boundaries are not a betrayal of your compassion. Your needs are not obstacles to connection. They are part of it. When you integrate your shadow, something subtle changes. You no longer give automatically. You choose. You no longer say yes out of fear. You pause. You no longer avoid tension at all costs. You tolerate it. And in that tolerance, you discover something unexpected. Most relationships do not collapse under honesty. They deepen. The ones that depended on your silence may resist. The ones that value your authenticity will adjust. Because when you stop performing goodness, you start embodying integrity. And integrity is steady. It does not fluctuate with approval. It does not disappear with disappointment. It does not need constant validation. The dark side of being too good was never about morality. It was about fragmentation, about splitting yourself into acceptable and unacceptable parts, about preserving connection by shrinking your complexity. But connection built on self-erasure is fragile. Wholeness is stronger. When you allow yourself to be human, to disappoint, to assert, to rest, to say no, you reclaim energy that was trapped in performance. Your kindness becomes lighter. Because it is no longer driven by fear, it becomes deliberate. Because it is no longer compulsory. And perhaps the deepest realization is this: you are still worthy even when someone is unhappy with you. You are still valuable even when you are not needed. You are still good even when you are not pleasing. Wholeness is not about becoming harder. It is about becoming real. And real people are complex. They contain light. They contain shadow. They contain contradiction. But they are not divided. When you no longer need to be too good, you are finally free to be complete. And completeness is far more powerful than perfection.